Every crisis in the West over the last 6 years has been instantly exploited to demand and then to implement more and more controls on online political speech. The Russiagate fraud, the 2020 election, the COVID pandemic, the January 6th riot, the war in Ukraine, each of them ushered in new and escalated forms of online censorship on the grounds that each presented dangers too grave to continue to permit speech to be unfettered. Exactly the same has been true for this new war between Israel and Gaza, which, like the war in Ukraine, Joe Biden is funding and arming with American resources while the EU stands by and cheers. From the very start of this war, this new war, the same officials and establishment figures in the West who have imposed this years-long censorship regime began doing so again, but this time on the ground that there was too much dangerous speech critical of Israel. That what needed to be silenced and suppressed was not conservative speech this time, but criticisms of the Israelis or support for the Palestinians. Censorship measures which many on the right, not all, but many, this time endorsed because the views to be silenced, criticisms of Israel deemed excessive, are views they disliked and were happy to see suppressed. Yesterday, CNN's anchor Dana Bash, who has been outspoken in her support for Israel and her determination to combat what she insists is a crisis of rising anti-Semitism on American college campuses, spoke to Democratic Senator Chris Murphy of Connecticut, and they both joined together to demand more controls of online speech in the name of this new war, in the name of protecting Israel from what they say are hatred and inaccurate information aimed at that country. For now, welcome to a new episode of System Update, starting right now. We have extensively covered, of course, the online censorship regime that has emerged in the wake of the 2016 enactment by British voters of Brexit, followed by the truly traumatic event for neoliberal institutions of power, which was the election of Donald Trump as American president over Hillary Clinton, and the conclusion that institutions of power reached that they can no longer afford free speech on the internet because doing so allows people to form their own views and to remain out of control from what neoliberal elites want them to do, especially how they want them to vote. And we've repeatedly identified the primary actors who participate in the construction and the implementation of this censorship regime, and among them are neoliberal billionaires, the U.S. security state, Western intelligence agencies, this new fraudulent disinformation industry, but also most importantly, led by the largest media corporations in the United States, who include people who have the job title journalists. These are the leading censorship advocates, as well as members of the Democratic Party who have explicitly been demanding from big tech that they censor more in alignment with their agendas, to the point that a federal court ruled the Obama administration's, or rather the Biden administration's, practice of doing this is so extreme that it's a grave violation of the First Amendment. Over the last 7 weeks, or almost 8 weeks now, since the October 7th massacre in Israel by Hamas, we have heard all kinds of new censorship calls for more controls for online speech, and they come from the very same people who have been constructing that censorship regime and controlling it for the last 7 years. Only this time, their targets aren't conservative speech, because so many conservatives are aligned with the pro-Israel perspective of most neoliberal institutions of power, including the US government, most European governments, and the corporate media. This time, their target are people who are critical of Israel or who express support for Palestinians. These kinds of people, people who are critical of Israel, who express support for Palestinians, have lost their jobs in large numbers here in the United States in politics and media. Student groups have been banned for expressing too much support for Palestinians, including by Governor Ron DeSantis in the University of Florida. There have been all sorts of efforts to try and constrain online political speech, and so it's not a surprise, at least it shouldn't be, that CNN, through its online anchor Dana Bash, who has been very explicit in her support for Israel, and particularly her concern for what she says is a online censorship, anti-Semitism crisis on American campuses, hosted the Democratic Senator from Chris Murphy of Connecticut. These people have been calling for censorship in the name of the war in Ukraine, in the name of January 6th, in the name of Russiagate, in the name of the 2020 election, in the name of January 6th, and now they're doing it again. Only this time they're doing it in order to protect this foreign country, Israel, which people like Chris Murphy and Dana Bash both support, and not just support, but want the US government to fund and arm. And Joe Biden, of course, just asked for another $14 billion in American money on top of the billions the U.S. gives to Israel every year to pay for and fund its war. So here was this discussion that both of them had about the need to do more censorship online, for big tech platforms to censor more, given what they regard as excessive criticism of Israel and what they claim is rising anti-Semitism on American college campuses.
Senator, we have seen an alarming spike in anti-Semitism, hate against Jews across the United States, but particularly on college campuses. You also sit on the Senate committee that deals with education. What's gone so wrong on America's college campuses that you have students openly applauding the terrorist killings of 1,200 or more civilians?
Yeah, listen, I'm all for free speech on our campuses, but I've been very disappointed at...
What is the favorite phrase of every censor in every culture and in every time period? I'm all for free speech, but when you hear that, go running, because an authoritarian has arrived. An authoritarian censor has arrived, and that, of course, is the first phrase that Chris Murphy uses to introduce his calls for censorship. I'm all for free speech, but...
Listen, I'm all for free speech on our campuses, but I've been very disappointed at the response of many of our university officials. There's a direct line between some of the most vicious anti-Semitism speech happening on our campus and threats of violence to synagogues and to Jewish communities. I ultimately, think we need to...
Now, let me just point out something here. In the last 7 weeks, a 6-year-old Muslim boy was murdered when an American broke into their house, screamed anti-Muslim slogans, and stabbed him to death multiple times and killed him. There have been Palestinians targeted for all sorts of abuse. There have been Jews who have felt unsafe validly as well. But the idea that there's only one faction that has extremists in it or people who engage in threats and violence is always wrong, always. There are bad people in every political faction and every political cause. Just 2 days ago in Burlington, Vermont, 3 20-year-old Palestinian students who are in the United States illegally to attend colleges like Brown were all shot, 2 of whom were wearing the traditional Palestinian scarf that identifies them as Arab or Palestinians. And they don't know the motive yet, but a lot of media outlets and groups and law enforcement agencies have strongly suggested that they need to investigate the possibility of a hate crime against American Palestinians or Palestinians legally here in the United States. So to try and pretend this is all one-sided when, for all the talk about the anti-Semitism threats on campus, there haven't been any murders of American Jews on campus of this kind or serious assaults that put people in hospitals. This is a crisis that is being exploited to justify censorship, just like every other crisis has since 2016, all the ones I just went through. I'm not denying that there's not a outpouring of a lot more intense criticism of Israel and even hatred toward Israel, and in some cases hatred for Jews as a result of watching 50 straight days of a bombing of Gaza that is of historic proportions, or at least unlike anything we've seen in the last century, in terms of number of civilians killed in such a short time, in terms of infrastructure destroyed, civilian infrastructure, making northern Gaza almost entirely unlivable. So the issue is not that there's no censorship in terms of what we're seeing in the United States. The issue is there's a lot of anti-Palestinian or anti-Arab hatred, as there always is when there's an outbreak of wars like this, and censorship is not needed. It is not a necessary solution, and yet they're exploiting this crisis and the fears that people have expressed, college students, of feeling unsafe, in order to demand it. Listen to what they say.
I ultimately, think we need to sort of think really hard about the way in which our young people are receiving information about this conflict. We need to hold accountable the social media sites, in particular TikTok, which is just full of virulent pro-Hamas and anti-Semitic material. The college campuses need to have a better means of accountability for this kind of hate speech. But we also have to recognize that these young people are getting their information from somewhere, often from a Chinese-controlled social media platform that has in its interest trying to turn America against each other. And one of the means...
I know that a lot of you think, a lot of conservatives have been trained to believe that the Democratic Party is this bastion of left-wing radicalism, and that it's not just on cultural issues where there's a real difference between the Democratic Party and American conservatives, although there is on issues like abortion and gun control and trans issues. If you think those are central to American political life and the distribution of power, then for sure there's big differences. But if you don't think that, on the policies that determine the distribution of wealth and power, the parties almost entirely agreed. They were in full agreement on Joe Biden's fueling of the war in Ukraine. There were about 6 dozen Republican members of Congress who voted no and have expressed opposition. But the entire Republican and Democratic establishments joined together. Obviously, they're completely joined when it comes to Israel. No dissent, almost, with the exception of maybe 8 or 9 members of Congress, one of whom has already been censored. The sole member of Congress of Palestinian descent, not for corrupt acts, but for her speech. And they also agree on China. The Republican Party, the American right, is not more antagonistic toward China than Joe Biden is. Joe Biden has militarily encircled China with bases in Japan, South Korea, the Philippines, Guam, all through the South China Sea. American planes are buzzing the Chinese planes. And here you see a Democratic senator saying, which is, we've covered this before and I'm going to do a whole show on it, but that TikTok is governed by the CCP, the Chinese Communist Party, to manipulate and propagandize American students, when in reality, TikTok is a capitalist company. They're desperate to remain in the United States. The FBI and CIA have been threatening to ban them and have instead extracted a promise for them to turn over censorship decisions, content moderation decisions to the U.S. security state, which is why TikTok banned the bin Laden letter. Why, if this is all about Chinese propaganda and turning Americans against their own country and in favor of the Chinese, why would TikTok ban the bin Laden letter, which sets aside multiple grievances against the United States? TikTok has banned multiple segments we've done on the war in Ukraine where we criticize the United States and NATO narrative. Why would they do that? But in any event, leave that aside. The Democratic Party agrees with you on this. They want to ban TikTok too. They've been demagoguing on this for a long time. And here they are saying that social media sites need to be better, more accountable, and control better the flow of information about this war, TikTok in particular, but not only. And administrations on college campuses need to hold people more accountable for their speech. These are classic calls for censorship, but of course a lot of people on the right, not all, but a lot, even though they don't want to admit it, are in full support of CNN and the Democratic Party censorship calls in this case because they're aligned with them on the issue of Israel. You can be aligned with CNN and the Democratic Party on the issue of Israel if you want. Cheer Joe Biden for wanting to give $14 billion more to Israel if you want. It doesn't mean you have to support the same censorship regime that you've been screaming bloody murder about since 2016, because usually it's directed at you. Let's listen to the rest.
The platform that has in its interest trying to turn America against each other. And one of the means they may be doing that is trying to promote a lot of pretty hateful and divisive material about the conflict in Gaza.
Every single time there's a significant part of the public that doesn't agree with them when they're voting for Donald Trump, when they don't believe Russiagate, when they polls show Donald Trump leading again, their view always is, the reason for this is because social media allows too much free speech and too much disinformation, and we have to control it to prevent people from holding views we disagree with. That is their solution to everything. Now, it's not just Chris Murphy. Here is Adam Schiff, one of the biggest bugaboos of the American right, who on November 21st said the following, quote, Elon Musk has been amplifying anti-Semitic content profiting from misinformation and allowing pro-Hamas propaganda to spread on X. This needs to stop. I've joined Congressman Dan Goldman and Congressman Jamie Raskin, both Democrats, in demanding accountability from X. Do you see they're taking this pro-Israel sentiment and using it, exploiting it to demand more censorship to protect Israel from criticism or to prevent people from expressing support for the Palestinian cause? Even if you support Adam Schiff's pro-Israel views, you should not want him with this power to control online speech just because in this one case, he's using it against your enemy, because very shortly he's going to be back to using it against you. At the very beginning of the war, 3 days before the bodies were even identified and cleared from Israel, the top EU official in charge of their censorship regime, this French official, Thierry Breton, decided to use the Gaza war, the war in Gaza, to say this proves yet again that the EU needs to censor Twitter because Elon Musk is allowing too much anti-Israel or pro-Hamas content to circulate online. Here from The Guardian, October 10th, just 3 days after the Hamas attack, the EU warns Elon Musk over, quote, disinformation on X about the Hamas attack. Quote, failing to moderate content such as fake news could incur a fine of 6% of X revenues or an EU blackout under new laws. We covered in full the letter that this EU censorship official sent to Elon Musk. Thierry Breton, the commissioner responsible for the act, wrote to Musk to urge him to ensure, quote, a prompt, accurate, and complete response to the request to contact Europol, the EU police enforcement agency, and, quote, relevant law enforcement agencies within the next 24 hours. There are concerns in Brussels that Twitter is not responding within 24 hours to complaints about disinformation or other illegal content such as hate speech within the required time. Now, here's part of the letter that this EU official, and if you support free speech at all, you should despise this Thierry Breton. When Elon Musk bought Twitter and said the bird will be free, Thierry Breton put a quote over him saying the bird may be free in other places, but in the EU it's subject to our censorship laws, threatening him that you're not going to bring free speech here to Europe. And he has been leading the way to demand and impose more censorship of political content from big tech. And here's the letter on October 10th, not even 3 days after the Hamas attack. It was October 8th when we really had a clear image, and 2 days later he was exploiting this new war to try and demand more censorship from Elon Musk. There you see the letter. The European Commission Chair Thierry Breton, member of the Commission, Brussels, October 10th, 2023. Dear Mr. Musk, following the terrorist attacks carried out by Hamas against Israel, we have indications that your platform is being used to disseminate illegal content and disinformation in the EU. Let me remind you that the Digital Services Act sets very precise obligations regarding content moderation. Given the urgency, I also expect you to be in contact with the relevant law enforcement authorities and Europol and ensure that you respond promptly to their requests. Moreover, on a number of issues of the Digital Services Act compliance, that's the new EU law that allows them to censor the internet and punish social media companies for not censoring, that deserve immediate attention. My team will follow up shortly with a specific request. I urge you to ensure a prompt, accurate, and complete response to this request within the next 24 hours. We will include your answer in our assessment file on your compliance with the law. I remind you that following the opening of a potential investigation and a finding of non-compliance, penalties can be imposed. Yours sincerely, Thierry Breton. Do you see what's happening here? Do you? They know that the American right and conservatives have been opposed to their censorship regime, so they're now trying to get them on their side by saying, look, in this case, we're on your side. We love Israel. We support Israel. We don't want there to be online content stimulating criticisms of Israel or support for the Palestinians. And we're going to use this word to demand that Elon Musk impose further constraints, and we're going to threaten him with all kinds of punishments if he fails to comply with our censorship orders. Not this time about COVID or Ukraine or the 2020 election or some other election in Europe, but this time to protect Israel from, quote, excessive criticisms or hate speech or disinformation. If you're going to cheer or acquiesce to censorship calls, because in one particular case, your political opponents this time are the targets, you are going to lose forever any moral credibility, any credibility, to pretend that you object in the future except on grounds of self-interest. You have no claim to believe in free speech if this is the sort of thing, if you're ready to get in bed with CNN and Chris Murphy and Adam Schiff and Jamie Raskin and Dan Goldman to censor the internet, this time in order to support Israel and protect it from criticisms.